Racist man rips off hijab, slams Muslim woman. Sky Marshals wrestle him to the floor. The atmosphere of Flight 2387 crackled with tension as Matthew Davidson's face contorted with rage. His finger jabbed accusingly at Fatima Nazari, who clutched the edges of her navy blue hijab with trembling fingers. "I saw what you were doing," Matthew shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. "Everyone saw it." Passengers froze in their seats, necks craning to witness the confrontation unfolding in the narrow aisle. Fatima's dark eyes widened with fear and confusion as Matthew's hand shot toward her head covering. In that suspended moment before contact, three figures moved simultaneously. Fatima jerking backward, Captain Alina Rodriguez emerging from the cockpit, and Air Marshal James Washington rising from his seat 4 rows back, hand already reaching beneath his jacket. But no one noticed 17-year-old Zoe Chen, who had been quietly observing everything from her window seat in 14A, her phone discreetly recording what everyone else had missed. 8 hours earlier, Terminal B at O'Hare International Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of a Friday morning. Passengers shuffled through security checkpoints, dragging carry-ons and balancing coffee cups while scrolling through phones. Captain Alina Rodriguez strode confidently through the crew entrance, her crisp uniform and purposeful gait parting the crowd like a ship's bow through water. At 57, Alina carried herself with the assurance of someone who had spent more than half her life commanding aircraft through the skies. The silver streaks in her dark hair caught the fluorescent lights as she nodded to the security personnel. "Morning, Captain," called out Terrence from behind the security desk. "Another day in paradise." Alina smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. 35,000 feet closer to it, at least. She tapped her flight plan against her palm. "Chicago to Phoenix today should be smooth sailing if the weather reports hold." As she continued toward the pre-flight briefing room, Alina's thoughts drifted to the letter she'd received yesterday, the one suggesting it might be time to consider the airline's early retirement package. After 32 years of flying, the thought of grounding herself permanently stirred a complex mixture of emotions. Piloting wasn't just her profession, it was her identity. What would Alina Rodriguez be without a cockpit and the endless sky? She pushed the thought away as she entered the briefing room where First Officer Derek Simmons waited, his boyish enthusiasm making her feel every one of her 57 years. "Morning, Captain," he said, practically bouncing on his toes. "Got the weather briefing already. Looks like we might catch some turbulence over Colorado, but nothing major." Alina nodded, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature. "Let's review the passenger manifest. Anything I should know about?" Derek glanced at his tablet. "Full flight. We've got an air marshal on board today, seat 17C names Washington." "Noted," Alina replied, wondering briefly what had prompted the assignment of a marshal to this routine domestic flight. "Anything else?" "Nothing unusual," Derek said, scrolling through the information. "Oh, we've got a 15-year-old traveling to visit Dad in Phoenix." Alina's mind flashed to her own daughter, now grown with children of her own in Seattle. How many birthdays and school events had she missed over the years, soaring above the clouds while life continued below? She pushed the thought away. "Let's get to the walkabout," she said, gathering her materials. "I want to be thorough today." At Gate B-17, Matthew Davidson checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 62, he prided himself on punctuality, a virtue he found increasingly rare in today's world. He straightened his beige sport coat and smoothed his salt and pepper hair, irritated by the announcement of another 15-minute boarding delay. His attention drifted to the young woman sitting across from him, head covered in a deep blue hijab, typing rapidly on her laptop. Something about her intense focus reminded him of his late wife Rebecca, who could become so absorbed in her research that the house could practically catch fire without her noticing. The thought of Rebecca sent a familiar pang through his chest. 3 years since cancer had taken her, and sometimes the grief still felt fresh enough to knock the wind from him. This trip to Phoenix was supposed to be their retirement celebration, the house they'd purchased together for their golden years. Now he was making the move alone, leaving behind their Chicago home of 30 years and all its memories. The young woman looked up suddenly, meeting his gaze. Matthew quickly averted his eyes, embarrassed to be caught staring. He busied himself with his phone, pulling up the email from his son Michael. "Dad, call when you land. We need to talk about the care facility for Grandma. The doctors think it's time." Matthew sighed deeply. Another difficult conversation awaited him in Phoenix, his mother's advancing dementia and the guilt of moving her from the only home she'd known for 50 years. At 87, Dorothy Davidson still had moments of perfect clarity, but they were becoming increasingly rare, islands of lucidity in a sea of confusion. The boarding announcement finally crackled over the loudspeaker, and Matthew gathered his carry-on, the leather bag Rebecca had given him on their 25th anniversary. He joined the line, finding himself behind the young woman in the hijab. "Excuse me," she said, turning to him with a slight smile. "Would you mind watching my bag for a moment? I need to make a quick call before we board." Her accent was barely perceptible, perhaps Middle Eastern, but with the rounded vowels of someone who had spent many years in America. "Of course," Matthew replied, surprising himself with his readiness to help. "Thank you, I'm Fatima," she said, extending her hand. "Matthew," he responded, taking her hand briefly. "Go ahead, I'll keep an eye out." As Fatima stepped away to make her call, Matthew found himself wondering about her story. Where was she headed? Did she have family waiting in Phoenix? The world had changed so much in his lifetime, growing both smaller through technology and somehow more divided through fear and misunderstanding. Rebecca would have already struck up a conversation, learning Fatima's life story before they even boarded the plane. Social ease had been her gift, not his. Another thing he missed about her. In the terminal restroom, 17-year-old Zoe Chen splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm her nerves. Flying alone wasn't the issue. She'd been doing that since her parents' divorce when she was 8. The knot in her stomach came from what awaited her in Phoenix. Another weekend of her father pretending everything was normal while his new wife, Melissa, made passive-aggressive comments about Zoe's college choices. Zoe dried her hands and studied her reflection, the purple-streaked black hair, the small nose ring her mother had finally permitted after months of negotiation, the dark circles under her eyes from staying up too late editing her latest documentary project. The film was her application piece for NYU's film program, her ticket to a future far from both Chicago and Phoenix. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Checked in yet? Remember to get a window seat if you can." Zoe rolled her eyes but typed back a quick, "Yes, Mom. About to board. Window seat secured." Her mother's hovering was suffocating sometimes, but it came from love, unlike her father's distant form of parenting that consisted mainly of Amazon gift cards and awkward weekend visits. Slinging her backpack over her shoulder, Zoe headed to the gate, arriving just as her boarding group was called. As she waited in line, she observed the other passengers, a habit developed from years of documentary filmmaking. The dignified older man with sadness etched into the lines around his eyes. The woman in the hijab speaking quietly but intensely into her phone. The broad-shouldered man in business casual attire whose eyes constantly scanned the crowd. Zoe's filmmaker instinct told her there were stories here, intersecting narratives about to collide in the confined space of an airplane cabin. She slipped her hand into her pocket, feeling the reassuring shape of her compact camera. If nothing else, the flight might provide some B-roll footage for her project. When she finally boarded the plane, Zoe found her window seat and settled in, plugging in her earbuds and turning up the volume on her carefully curated playlist. As the cabin filled around her, she closed her eyes, mentally preparing for takeoff and the uncomfortable weekend that awaited her in Phoenix. James Washington methodically surveyed each passenger as they boarded, a professional habit developed over 15 years as a federal air marshal. At 48, James had spent nearly half his life protecting aircraft from those who would do harm, though most of his deployments were as uneventful as he expected today's to be. He maintained his deliberately forgettable appearance, business casual clothing that wouldn't draw attention, a neutral expression that revealed nothing of his constant vigilance. James blended into the background by design, just another business traveler among many. His seat in 17C gave him optimal sightlines down the main aisle. As passengers stowed bags and settled in, James noted details with practiced precision. The fidgety young man in 9B who kept checking his watch, probably just afraid of flying. The elderly woman in 11D who seemed confused about her seat assignment, cognitive issues, not a threat. The teenage girl with purple-streaked hair in 14A who was filming the boarding process with her phone, typical Gen Z behavior. His attention lingered slightly longer on the woman in the navy hijab taking her seat in 16B. Standard protocol required extra scrutiny, though James had long ago recognized the inherent bias in such thinking. In 15 years, not once had his interventions involved anyone fitting the profile that nervous Americans associated with terrorism. The actual incidents he'd handled involved intoxicated businessmen, psychologically disturbed individuals, or domestic disputes that escalated in the confined cabin space. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and confident. "Good afternoon, this is Captain Rodriguez. Welcome aboard Flight 2387 to Phoenix. We're currently looking at an on-time departure and smooth conditions for most of our journey, with some light turbulence as we approach the Rockies. We'll have you updated throughout the flight. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." James settled back as the safety demonstration began. 3 hours to Phoenix. With any luck, this would be another uneventful deployment where his training remained unused, his weapon stayed holstered, and his identity unknown to everyone except the flight crew. Fatima Nazari settled into seat 16B, carefully arranging her laptop bag under the seat in front of her. At 34, she had grown accustomed to the subtle shifts in atmosphere when she boarded planes, the sideways glances, the occasionally more obvious stares at her hijab. Today seemed no different, though the older gentleman who had watched her bag at the gate, Matthew, he'd said, had been surprisingly kind. She checked her phone one last time before switching to airplane mode, rereading the email from the hospital administrator in Phoenix. "Dr. Nazari, we look forward to your arrival tomorrow for the interview. As discussed, the position would involve overseeing our newly expanded pediatric oncology department. Your research on adaptive immunotherapy treatments has impressed the board considerably." The opportunity represented everything Fatima had worked toward since leaving Iran at 18, a chance to implement her research in ways that could save children's lives. Yet the timing couldn't be more complicated. Her mother's health was declining in Chicago, and the thought of moving farther away filled her with guilt. As the plane began taxiing, Fatima closed her eyes briefly, saying a small prayer for guidance. When she opened them, she noticed the man across the aisle, Matthew, struggling with his seatbelt, his fingers seemingly stiff and uncooperative. Without thinking, she leaned slightly toward him. "May I help?" Matthew looked up, surprise evident in his expression before it softened into gratitude. "Arthritis," he explained, holding up gnarled fingers, "gets worse every year." Fatima nodded sympathetically as she helped secure his seatbelt. "My mother has the same issue. Have you tried turmeric supplements? There's some promising research about their anti-inflammatory properties." "My wife used to say the same thing," Matthew replied, a flicker of sorrow crossing his features. "She was big on natural remedies." The past tense didn't escape Fatima's notice. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Matthew said simply, turning toward the window as the plane accelerated down the runway. Fatima settled back into her seat, respecting his obvious desire for privacy. As the ground fell away beneath them, she opened her laptop to review her presentation for tomorrow's interview, unaware of how her life would intertwine with those around her in the hours to come. 2 hours into the flight, Elena Rodriguez monitored the aircraft systems with the vigilance that had become second nature over her long career. The light turbulence she'd predicted was materializing as they crossed over Colorado, nothing concerning but enough to illuminate the fasten seatbelt signs and pause the in-flight service. "How much longer until retirement?" Derek asked beside her, his voice casual as he adjusted their heading slightly. Elena shot him a sideways glance. "Who says I'm retiring?" Derek shrugged. "Just rumors in the crew lounge. They say the company's offering packages to senior pilots." Elena's hands tightened imperceptibly on the controls, so it wasn't just her who'd received the letter. 32 years in the air," she said after a moment. "Hard to imagine being grounded permanently." "My dad felt the same way," Derek offered. "Navy pilot. When he couldn't fly anymore, he built model airplanes in the garage. Said if he couldn't be in the sky, he'd bring the sky to him." Elena smiled despite herself. Smart man. Also stubborn. Remind you of anyone, Captain. Before Elena could respond, a chime indicated an incoming call from the cabin. She pressed the communication button. Captain speaking. Captain, this is Allison, came the lead flight attendant's voice. We have a situation developing in the main cabin. Nothing emergency level yet, but I thought you should be aware. Elena exchanged glances with Derek. What kind of situation? A male passenger is becoming agitated, complaining that another passenger is acting suspiciously. He's getting rather loud about it. Has the air marshal been notified? Yes, he's monitoring, but hasn't intervened yet. Keep me posted, Elena said. I'll come back if things escalate. As she ended the communication, Elena felt a familiar tension building at the base of her neck. In her experience, cabin conflicts rarely resolved themselves without intervention, and at 35,000 feet, options were limited. She hoped the air marshal's presence would be deterrent enough, but something told her this flight was about to become more complicated than the routine trip she'd anticipated. The turbulence had been steadily increasing for the past 20 minutes, each jolt making Matthew grip his armrests tighter. He'd never been a comfortable flyer, but Rebecca had always been there to distract him with conversation or hold his hand during the worst bumps. Flying alone amplified every sensation, the drop in his stomach during air pockets, the creaking of the aircraft as it fought against invisible currents. He tried focusing on his book, but the words blurred before his eyes. Instead, his attention drifted to the woman in the hijab, Fatima, across the aisle. She had been working intently on her laptop since takeoff, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. Now she was reaching into her bag, removing something small and metallic that she concealed partially in her palm. Matthew's heart rate increased. Was that a small tool of some kind? He watched as she glanced around furtively before leaning down toward her bag again. Get a grip, Matthew, he chided himself. She's probably just getting medication or a USB drive or any of 1,000 innocent items. But then he remembered the news story he'd watched last night, something about increased security alerts for domestic flights. And hadn't there been unusual delays at the boarding gate? The same gate where Fatima had asked him to watch her bag while she made a mysterious phone call. Another bout of turbulence shook the plane, and Matthew saw Fatima press something on her phone before quickly putting it away. His anxiety, already heightened by the rough flight, found a focus point. What if he'd been manipulated into watching a bag that contained something dangerous? What if her frequent typing wasn't work-related but communications with accomplices? The thought, once formed, refused to dissipate. Matthew found himself watching Fatima more intently, interpreting each movement through a lens of suspicion. When she reached down again toward her bag, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Fatima looked up, startled. "Excuse me." "Your bag, you keep reaching for something in your bag," Matthew said, aware that his voice was rising but unable to control it. "And that metal thing you took out earlier, what was that?" Confusion spread across Fatima's face. "I don't understand what you're—" "I saw you," Matthew interrupted, his fear overwhelming his rationality. "You've been acting strangely since we boarded, making calls, typing constantly, looking around to see if anyone's watching you." Several nearby passengers turned to stare at the commotion. Fatima's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she realized what Matthew was implying. "Sir, you're mistaken," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm a doctor. I'm working on a presentation for a job interview tomorrow." "Then what was that metal object?" Matthew demanded, aware somewhere in the recesses of his mind that he was making a scene but propelled forward by a toxic mixture of fear and certainty. "My insulin pump controller," Fatima answered, her voice remaining level despite the accusation in his tone. "I'm diabetic." A flicker of doubt crossed Matthew's mind, but the turbulence chose that moment to worsen, the plane dropping suddenly before stabilizing. His anxiety spiked again, overwhelming his reason. "I don't believe you," he said, loud enough now that passengers several rows away turned to look. "You asked me to watch your bag at the gate. How do I know what you put in there?" A flight attendant approached, her professional smile strained. "Is everything all right here?" No, Matthew said before Fatima could speak. This woman has been acting suspiciously the entire flight. She keeps reaching into her bag. She has some kind of device. Sir, the flight attendant interrupted, her voice lowered. Please keep your voice down. If you have concerns, we can discuss them privately. Privately, Matthew's voice rose further. If she's planning something, everyone here needs to know. He gestured wildly at Fatima. She could be a doctor heading to a job interview, Fatima interjected, her composure finally cracking. Which I've already told you. What you're doing right now is profiling me because of how I look and what I wear. The accusation hit Matthew like a physical blow. That's not true, he protested, though a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps it was. I saw you acting suspiciously. The flight attendant placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder. Sir, I need you to lower your voice and calm down, or I'll have to report this disturbance to the captain. Before Matthew could respond, another jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, more severe than before. Overhead bins rattled, and someone's drink spilled several rows ahead. The moment of distraction gave Matthew a chance to observe how other passengers were reacting, the looks of discomfort on their faces, some directed at the turbulence, others clearly aimed at him. Had he overreacted? The doubt began to grow, but then he saw Fatima reach toward her bag again, and his suspicion flared anew. She's doing it again, he exclaimed, pointing. Look. Zoe Chen had been observing the entire interaction from her seat in 14A, first with casual interest, then with growing dismay, and finally with the detached focus of a documentarian. Without drawing attention to herself, she had begun recording on her phone, capturing the escalating confrontation between the older man and the woman in the hijab. As a child of the post-9/11 world, Zoe had grown up with the ambient awareness of profiling and prejudice. Her Chinese-American mother had experienced her share of racism, especially during international trips, and had taught Zoe to recognize injustice when she saw it. What she was witnessing now seemed like a textbook case of prejudice-fueled panic, an older white man targeting a Muslim woman based on nothing but his own fears and misinterpretations. Yet there was something about the man's genuine distress that complicated the narrative. He wasn't performing outrage. He appeared genuinely frightened. Zoe zoomed in slightly, capturing the woman's dignified frustration and the man's agitated gestures. This was primary source material for her documentary on modern American tensions, better than anything she could have scripted. When the older man pointed accusingly at the woman's bag, Zoe adjusted her angle to capture what happened next. The woman, Fatima, Zoe had heard her called, reached into her bag and deliberately pulled out a small medical device. This is an insulin pump controller, Fatima said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, holding it up. I am a diabetic physician traveling for a job interview, that's all. The evidence seemed irrefutable, but the older man, Matthew, shook his head. How do we know that's what it really is? He persisted, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. It could be modified to look like a medical device. A murmur ran through the surrounding passengers, opinions clearly divided. Some seemed sympathetic to Matthew's concerns, while others appeared embarrassed or angered by his accusations. The atmosphere in the cabin had become noticeably tense. Zoe continued filming, capturing the flight attendants' increasingly firm attempts to de-escalate the situation and the expressions of the passengers around them. This was no longer just an isolated incident between two people. It had become a microcosm of larger societal tensions, playing out at 35,000 feet with nowhere for anyone to go. The seatbelt sign dinged, illuminating as the turbulence intensified. The flight attendant, now looking genuinely concerned, leaned down to speak quietly to Fatima before moving back toward the galley, presumably to contact the captain. Zoe zoomed out slightly to capture the wider scene and noticed something she hadn't before, a man several rows back who was watching the confrontation with unusual intensity. Unlike the other passengers who were either openly staring or deliberately looking away, this man's attention had a different quality to it, focused, analytical, professional. Something about his posture suggested readiness. Zoe's documentary filmmaker instincts kicked in. There was more to this story than a simple case of prejudice and misunderstanding. Something else was happening beneath the surface, and her camera was capturing it all. If you're watching this and finding yourself immersed in this unfolding confrontation at 35,000 feet, I'm curious to know where you're viewing from. The tensions we're exploring resonate differently depending on your own experiences and perspective. Take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. Your city, state, or country adds another dimension to this conversation about misconceptions and hasty judgments. Now, let's return to that tense moment on Flight 2387 as Captain Rodriguez makes a crucial decision. In the cockpit, Alina listened intently to Allison's update on the situation, her experienced mind quickly assessing the potential risks. A passenger dispute was escalating despite flight attendant intervention. Tensions were spreading among surrounding passengers, and they were still an hour from Phoenix with moderate turbulence making a smooth flight impossible. "I'll come back," Alina decided, turning to Derek. "Take the controls." "Are you sure that's necessary?" Derek asked, though he was already adjusting his position to assume command. "The air marshal hasn't intervened yet." "Sometimes authority presence can de-escalate before security intervention becomes necessary," Alina replied, unfastening her harness. "I've seen these situations spiral quickly. Better to address it now." As Alina made her way to the cabin, she composed her approach. In 32 years of flying, she'd learned that passenger conflicts required a delicate balance, enough firmness to establish control, enough empathy to diffuse emotions. The captain's uniform itself often did half the work, its authority a reminder of the structured environment of an aircraft where social norms were even more important than on the ground. When she emerged from the cockpit, Alina immediately spotted the disturbance, an older man standing in the aisle, gesturing animatedly toward a seated woman in a hijab, with a flight attendant attempting to calm him. Several passengers were filming with their phones, while others were visibly uncomfortable. Alina moved purposefully down the aisle, her presence causing heads to turn. The Air Marshal, Washington, according to the manifest, made brief eye contact with her from his seat, a silent communication that he was monitoring but letting her take the lead for now. "What seems to be the problem here?" Alina asked, her voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in command. The older man turned to her, relief evident in his expression. "Captain, this woman has been acting suspiciously the entire flight. She keeps reaching into her bag. She has some kind of electronic device." "Sir, please take your seat," Alina interrupted firmly. "Aircraft aisles need to remain clear, especially during turbulence." To her satisfaction, the man complied immediately, though his agitation remained evident as he sat. Alina turned to the woman in the hijab, whose composed expression couldn't quite mask her distress. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Yes, Captain," she replied. "There's been a misunderstanding. This gentleman believes I'm doing something suspicious, but I'm simply managing my diabetes and working on my laptop." Alina nodded, then addressed both passengers and the surrounding rows. "Listen carefully. We are in a metal tube traveling at 500 miles per hour, 7 miles above the Earth. In this environment, everyone's safety depends on maintaining calm and order. Whatever concerns exist can be addressed rationally." She turned specifically to the man. "Sir, what's your name?" "Matthew Davidson," he answered, his voice steadier now but still tense. "Mr. Davidson, I understand you have concerns. Aviation security is a priority for all of us. Can you tell me specifically what you observed that alarmed you?" Matthew seemed momentarily caught off guard by the direct question. She kept looking around nervously, typing constantly on her phone and laptop. "She asked me to watch her bag at the gate while she made a call, and she has some kind of device she keeps checking." Alina turned to the woman. "And your name, ma'am?" "Dr. Fatima Nazari," she replied, emphasizing her title slightly. "I'm an oncologist traveling to Phoenix for a job interview. The device Mr. Davidson is concerned about is my insulin pump controller." She held up the small electronic device. "I'm type 1 diabetic." Alina nodded, deliberately taking time to consider both statements, though her assessment had already begun the moment she entered the cabin. Dr. Nazari displayed the composed demeanor of someone wrongfully accused, but attempting to handle it with dignity. Matthew showed the agitation of genuine fear, not malice. Dr. Nazari, would you be willing to show me identification confirming you're a physician? Elena asked. Of course, Fatima replied, reaching for her wallet and producing a hospital ID card. Elena examined it, noting the credentials and photo matched the woman before her. And the device, that's standard medical equipment. Yes, Fatima confirmed. I'd be happy to demonstrate how it works if that would help. Elena turned back to Matthew. Mr. Davidson, does this information address your concerns? Matthew hesitated, the conflict evident on his face. It could be fake, he said, though with less conviction. We can't be too careful these days. A ripple of disapproval ran through the surrounding passengers. Elena recognized the need to resolve this quickly before group dynamics further complicated the situation. Mr. Davidson, I have 3 decades of experience ensuring passenger safety, she said firmly. I've reviewed Dr. Nazari's identification and explanation. I find no cause for concern. Now we all have a choice to make. We can escalate this situation, or we can return to a peaceful flight. The turbulence chose that moment to intensify, the plane dropping suddenly before stabilizing. Elena maintained her footing with practiced ease, using the moment to reinforce her point. Nature is giving us enough excitement today without adding human drama, she said, allowing a small smile to soften her words. Let's all take a deep breath and remember we're all just trying to get to Phoenix safely. The tension in the cabin noticeably decreased, several passengers nodding in agreement. Matthew looked down, embarrassment beginning to replace his agitation. Now, Elena continued, I'm going to return to the cockpit to navigate us through this turbulence. I expect that when I close that door, this matter will be resolved. Is that clear? Both Matthew and Fatima nodded, though neither looked at the other. As Elena turned to leave, satisfied that immediate crisis had been averted, she caught the eye of the air marshal again. Washington gave a slight nod of approval but remained vigilant. Experience told Elena the situation had been diffused but not completely resolved. The underlying tensions would simmer for the remainder of the flight. Back in the cockpit, Derek raised an eyebrow questioningly. Crisis averted for now, Elena said, strapping herself in. Textbook case of misunderstanding amplified by flying anxiety. Nice work, Derek commented. I could feel the tension even from in here. Elena took control of the aircraft again, feeling the familiar response of the plane to her touch. If only human emotions could be navigated as predictably as aircraft. She had a feeling they hadn't seen the last of the conflict between Matthew Davidson and Dr. Nazari. James Washington remained in his seat after Captain Rodriguez returned to the cockpit, but his state of alertness had increased. What had begun as a routine passenger dispute now warranted closer monitoring. Not because he believed Dr. Nazari posed any threat, his assessment aligned with the captain's, but because Matthew Davidson's emotional state remained volatile. In James's experience, the most unpredictable element in any security situation was fear. Fear bypassed reason, overrode social norms, and could transform otherwise reasonable people into genuine threats. Davidson was afraid, that much was clear, and despite the captain's intervention, that fear hadn't been fully addressed. From his vantage point, James could see both Matthew and Fatima. Matthew was staring rigidly ahead, his posture tense, occasionally glancing sideways toward Fatima. For her part, Dr. Nazari had returned to her laptop, though her movements seemed more self-conscious now, aware of being watched. The air marshal shifted slightly, ensuring he could move quickly if needed. His training emphasized prevention over reaction, identifying and diffusing potential situations before they required physical intervention. Sometimes that meant approaching a passenger directly, but in this case, visibility might only escalate tensions further. James noticed the teenage girl with purple-streaked hair was still recording discreetly from her window seat. In another context, he might have been concerned about the privacy implications, but right now, an objective record of events might prove valuable if the situation deteriorated. The turbulence had decreased somewhat, though the seatbelt sign remained illuminated. James watched as a flight attendant approached Matthew with a cup of water, leaning down to speak quietly to him. Whatever she said caused his shoulders to relax slightly, a good sign. Perhaps the remainder of the flight would pass without incident after all. But James Washington hadn't stayed alive this long by making optimistic assumptions. He remained vigilant, eyes constantly monitoring the cabin environment while appearing to any casual observer like just another passenger reading a magazine. When the turbulence finally eased and the captain switched off the seatbelt sign, Fatima felt the tension in her body begin to unwind. The confrontation with Matthew had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Despite years in America, despite her education and professional accomplishments, despite everything she'd done to build a life here, moments like this reinforced how tenuous her belonging could be, how quickly she could be transformed from Dr. Nazari to a suspicious foreigner. She glanced at her insulin pump readings, adjusting the settings slightly. The stress had affected her blood sugar levels, as it always did. Another small indignity, having to manage her medical condition while simultaneously managing someone else's bigotry. That wasn't entirely fair, she admitted to herself. The man seemed genuinely frightened, not malicious. Fear could make people see threats where none existed. As a doctor, she understood that the human brain was wired to find patterns, to detect potential dangers, sometimes creating false positives in the process. Still, the hurt lingered. The public humiliation, the stares from other passengers, the need to prove her legitimacy, these were burdens that followed her through life, invisible to those who never had to carry them. Fatima saved her work and closed her laptop. The presentation wouldn't improve with further tinkering, and her concentration was shot anyway. Tomorrow's interview would have to proceed with what she'd prepared already. She tried to focus on the opportunity awaiting her in Phoenix, the chance to develop treatments that could save children's lives, to implement research that had consumed years of her professional life. A movement caught her attention. Matthew was getting up from his seat, his expression difficult to read. Fatima tensed involuntarily as he paused in the aisle beside her. "Dr. Nazari," he said, his voice low and uncertain, "I believe I owe you an apology." The words surprised her, though she maintained a neutral expression, waiting for him to continue. I let my anxiety about flying get the better of me," Matthew said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before darting away. "And I made assumptions that were unfair to you. I'm sorry." The apology seemed genuine, if awkward. Fatima considered her response carefully. Part of her wanted to dismiss him, to protect the emotional walls she'd constructed after too many similar incidents. But another part, the part that had driven her to become a healer, recognized the courage it took to acknowledge a mistake. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Davidson," she replied finally. "Apology accepted." Relief washed over Matthew's features, followed by lingering embarrassment. He nodded and continued toward the lavatory at the back of the plane. Fatima exhaled slowly, surprised by how much the simple exchange had affected her. Perhaps it was the unexpectedness of it, how rarely such incidents ended with acknowledgement rather than entrenchment. Or perhaps it was recognition of the universal human vulnerability they shared, her fear of being ostracized, his fear of unseen threats, both of them navigating an uncertain world as best they could. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from across the aisle. An elderly woman with kind eyes leaned slightly toward her. "I have a granddaughter who's studying medicine," the woman said. "She wants to specialize in pediatrics too. It's not an easy path, is it?" "No," Fatima replied with a small smile, "but it's a worthwhile one." "The world needs more healers," the woman continued. "Especially now." She gestured subtly toward where Matthew had been sitting, a knowing look in her eyes. The simple moment of solidarity touched Fatima deeply. For every Matthew who feared her, there were others who saw her, really saw her, as she was. The thought provided a measure of comfort as she settled back in her seat, grateful for the reminder. Matthew splashed cold water on his face in the tiny airplane lavatory, avoiding his own reflection in the mirror. Shame washed over him in waves, shame at his behavior, at the scene he'd caused, at the way he'd treated Dr. Nazari. What had he been thinking? He hadn't been thinking, that was the problem. Fear had hijacked his brain, converting ordinary actions into sinister plots, seeing threats where there were none. He'd become exactly the kind of person Rebecca would have been ashamed of, judgmental, reactionary, unkind. The apology he'd offered felt woefully inadequate compared to the public humiliation he'd put Dr. Nazari through. She had accepted it with more grace than he deserved, but that only deepened his remorse. As he dried his hands, Matthew confronted the uncomfortable truth beneath his behavior. His fear of flying had been only part of the equation. The rest was a toxic mixture of grief, stress, and the quiet prejudices he'd never fully acknowledged to himself. Assumptions about who belonged and who didn't, who was suspicious and who wasn't. Rebecca would have seen through it immediately. She'd always been his moral compass, challenging his narrower perspectives with her boundless empathy. Without her, he'd been adrift, reverting to baser instincts he thought he'd outgrown. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to compose himself before returning to his seat. The remaining hour of the flight stretched before him like an eternity of awkwardness. What must the other passengers think of him now? What did he think of himself? A gentle knock on the door startled him. "Just a moment," he called, giving his face one final rinse before opening the door. The teenage girl with purple-streaked hair stood waiting, an unreadable expression on her young face. Matthew stepped aside, mumbling an apology as he tried to squeeze past her in the narrow space. "I saw what happened," she said abruptly, stopping him, "with you and the doctor." Matthew froze, mortification flooding through him. "I behaved terribly," he admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "I've apologized to her." "I recorded it," the girl continued, holding up her phone. "The whole thing." A new wave of shame rolled over Matthew. Of course she had. In today's world, public humiliation wasn't confined to the moment. It was preserved digitally, potentially forever. "Are you going to post it online?" he asked, resignation in his voice. He could already imagine the headlines. "Racist boomer harasses Muslim doctor on flight." Another viral moment of American division and intolerance. The girl studied him for a long moment. "I'm making a documentary," she said finally, "about how people see each other or don't see each other, about the stories we tell ourselves about strangers." Matthew wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm not sure I'd be a very flattering addition to your film." "Maybe not," she agreed. "But maybe you'd be a human one. People are complicated. Fear makes us do things we regret." There was a wisdom in her young face that reminded Matthew painfully of his own daughter at that age, before adult cynicism had crept in, when she could still see the world with such clarity. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zoe," she replied. "Zoe Chen." "Well, Zoe Chen, you seem to understand people better than I do, and I've got about 45 years on you." A small smile touched her lips. "I just watch carefully, most people don't." With that, she slipped past him into the lavatory, leaving Matthew standing in the aisle, strangely moved by the brief encounter. Perhaps the younger generation wasn't as lost as his contemporaries often claimed. Perhaps they were simply seeing with clearer eyes than their elders had managed. As he made his way back to his seat, Matthew felt a strange lightness despite his lingering embarrassment. The conversation with Zoe had reminded him of something essential that he'd forgotten in his grief over Rebecca, in his anxiety about his mother, in all the transitions and losses of recent years. The importance of truly seeing people as they were, not as his fears painted them. He caught Fatima's eye as he passed her seat and managed a small nod which she returned. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was acknowledgement, a tiny bridge across the chasm his actions had created. For now, that would have to be enough. Zoe locked the lavatory door behind her, leaning against it as she replayed her conversation with Matthew. She hadn't planned to speak to him. It had been an impulse, born from watching the complex emotions play across his face when he apologized to Dr. Nazari. She pulled out her phone, reviewing the footage she'd captured. The confrontation itself was compelling, the rising tension, the captain's intervention, the uncomfortable aftermath. But what interested her more were the moments in between, the micro-expressions that revealed internal struggles, the small gestures of kindness from other passengers, the silent communication between the captain and the watchful man in 17C whom Zoe had pegged as some kind of security personnel. This wasn't just footage for her NYU application anymore. It was something more significant, a chronicle of how fear and misunderstanding could escalate, but also how human connection could begin to heal those divisions. When she returned to her seat, Zoe noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted subtly. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by the collective relief of passengers who had witnessed a potential crisis diffused. Conversations had resumed, the routine of flight restored. She put on her headphones but didn't play any music, instead listening to the ambient sounds of the aircraft while watching the interactions around her. The remainder of the flight would probably be uneventful, but Zoe had learned that the most revealing moments often came after the drama, in the quiet spaces where people processed and reflected. Her father would be waiting at Phoenix Sky Harbor, probably checking his watch impatiently and already formulating bland questions about school that wouldn't require him to truly engage with her life. For the first time, Zoe wondered what fears and misunderstandings might be shaping his behavior, what stories he told himself to make sense of their strained relationship. Perhaps, she thought as she raised her camera again, there was a wider story to tell than she had originally planned, not just about prejudice and misperception, but about the universal human struggle to truly see one another across the divides of generation, culture, and experience. As the captain announced their initial descent into Phoenix, James Washington made his final assessment of the cabin. The situation appeared fully stabilized. Matthew Davidson was reading quietly, Dr. Nazari was putting away her laptop, and the other passengers had returned to their own concerns. His services had not been needed after all, which was always the optimal outcome. Yet something about the incident lingered in his mind. In 15 years as an air marshal, James had witnessed countless confrontations, most stemming from mundane causes: intoxication, entitlement, mental health issues. This one had been different, a window into the broader societal tensions he observed daily on the ground, now playing out at 35,000 feet. What struck him most wasn't the confrontation itself, but its resolution. How a moment of potential chaos had been transformed through Captain Rodriguez's calm authority, through Dr. Nazari's dignified restraint, through Matthew's belated but seemingly genuine remorse. There was something hopeful in that transformation, a reminder that most people, when given the chance, could find their way back to better versions of themselves. The aircraft banked slightly as it aligned with the approach path to Phoenix. James secured his belongings, preparing for landing while maintaining his vigilance. He'd file his report later, another uneventful deployment in the official record. But unofficially, he'd remember this flight as a reminder of both human frailty and resilience. His gaze crossed briefly with Zoe's, the teenager with the camera. She'd been watching him, he realized, had perhaps identified his role despite his deliberate anonymity. There was an unusual perceptiveness in her young eyes, an ability to see beneath surfaces. James gave her a barely perceptible nod, which she returned with equal subtlety before turning back to her window. The younger generation was paying attention, James thought, perhaps more closely than his own generation realized. That, too, gave him a measure of hope as the ground rose to meet them. Elena guided the aircraft through its final approach, the familiar rhythm of landing procedures a counterpoint to her reflections on the events in the cabin. In 32 years of flying, she'd witnessed countless human dramas unfold in the artificial environment of an aircraft. Today's incident had been relatively minor in the grand scheme, successfully de-escalated, no official intervention required, no diversion necessary. Yet it had stirred thoughts of her impending retirement in ways she hadn't anticipated. For decades, her role had been clear: transport passengers safely from origin to destination, navigate the complexities of weather and mechanics, maintain order in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. The clarity of those responsibilities had defined her life. "Looking good," Derek commented beside her as they descended through 2,000 feet. "Winds holding steady." Elena nodded, making a small adjustment to their approach. Beyond the windshield, Phoenix spread across the desert landscape, shimmering in the afternoon heat. Another city, another landing, another group of passengers who would disperse to their various destinations, their brief community of flight dissolved. But today's flight had reminded her of something important, that even in retirement, her skills would remain relevant. Not the technical abilities of flying an aircraft, perhaps, but the human ones. Staying calm in crisis, seeing clearly when others couldn't, bringing order to chaos through quiet authority. As the wheels touched down on the runway with barely a bump, one of her signature smooth landings, Elena felt a familiar satisfaction. Whatever came next, she would approach it with the same steady hand that had guided aircraft for more than 3 decades. The sky had taught her well. The cabin erupted in the customary light applause as the aircraft touched down with barely a jolt. Fatima joined in automatically, her mind already shifting to what awaited her in Phoenix. The interview, the potential new position, the life she might build here. The incident with Matthew had faded somewhat, relegated to the background of more immediate concerns. Yet it had left her with questions that lingered. How many similar moments of misunderstanding shaped the world without ever being resolved? How many fears went unacknowledged, hardening into prejudices that separated people who might otherwise connect? As a physician, Fatima dealt with human vulnerability daily, the physical kind that brought people to hospitals and clinics seeking help. But today had been a reminder of another kind of vulnerability, the emotional and social kind that often went undiagnosed and untreated. The aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers already reaching for phones and gathering belongings despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. Fatima remained seated, in no rush to join the inevitable crowding in the aisle. From the corner of her eye, she saw Matthew doing the same. After a moment of hesitation, she turned toward him. "Good luck with whatever brings you to Phoenix, Mr. Davidson." Matthew looked surprised at her initiation of conversation. "Thank you," he replied. I'm moving here actually, retirement." "New beginnings," Fatima offered. "Yes," Matthew said, a flicker of something, grief, hope, crossing his features, though some endings too. The simple exchange felt significant somehow. A small bridge extended across the chasm that had opened between them earlier. Not friendship, certainly, but acknowledgement of shared humanity, which was, perhaps, where all healing began. As the seatbelt sign finally dinged off and passengers surged into the aisle, Fatima gathered her belongings with a sense of cautious optimism. Whatever the outcome of tomorrow's interview, today had reinforced her belief in the possibility of change in others and in herself. When the aircraft door finally opened, Matthew waited patiently for his row to be called, watching as passengers filed past. The teenage girl, Zoe, caught his eye as she passed, giving him a small nod that felt oddly like absolution. His phone buzzed with a text from his son. "At baggage claim, Mom's nurse called good day today, recognized everyone." A small mercy, Matthew thought. Perhaps he would have a lucid conversation with his mother this evening, one of the increasingly rare windows where the woman who had raised him was fully present. Tomorrow, she might not remember his visit at all, but today would be a gift. As he finally rose to leave, Matthew found himself face to face with Dr. Nazari in the slow shuffle toward the exit. The awkwardness was palpable, but somehow less sharp than before. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her quietly. "I am truly sorry." "I know," Fatima replied, "and I meant it when I accepted your apology." They moved forward together in the line, an unlikely pair connected by the strange intimacy that sometimes arose between strangers in transit. "My wife had diabetes too," Matthew said after a moment. "She always said the hardest part wasn't the condition itself, but other people's reactions to it." "Your wife sounds like she was very wise," Fatima replied. "She was," Matthew agreed, the familiar ache of loss tempered now by something else, the bittersweet warmth of remembered connection. "She would have liked you." As they emerged from the jetway into the terminal, Matthew felt a strange sense of completion. This flight, which he had dreaded as merely a necessary transition between his old life and his new one, had become something more significant. A reminder, perhaps, that transitions were not just physical journeys from one place to another, but internal ones as well. Ahead, he could see his son waiting, scanning the arriving passengers with mild impatience. Behind lay Chicago and all its memories. Here, in this liminal space between departure and arrival, past and future, Matthew Davidson had glimpsed a version of himself he thought he'd lost, capable of acknowledging mistakes, of seeing beyond his fears to the humanity of others. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a beginning. Zoe spotted her father immediately, standing near a column, eyes on his phone rather than scanning the crowd for her. Some things never changed. She adjusted her backpack, preparing for the weekend of polite distance and awkward conversation that awaited her. But something had shifted inside her during the flight. The documentary project, which had begun as simply a means to escape, a ticket to film school, and a future far from both her divorced parents' separate worlds, now felt like something more meaningful. The footage she'd captured today wasn't just about conflict and misunderstanding. It was about the possibility of connection across the divides that separated people. As she approached her father, Zoe made a decision. Instead of the usual minimal engagement, she would try something different this weekend. She would ask questions. She would listen. She would try to see the man behind the role of distant father, to understand what fears and hopes shaped his actions, just as she had begun to understand Matthew on the plane. "Hey, Dad," she called, raising her hand in greeting. Her father looked up, a smile spreading across his face that seemed, for once, genuinely pleased rather than merely obligatory. "There's my girl," he said, stepping forward to take her bag. "How was your flight?" Zoe thought of the drama she'd witnessed, the complexity of human interaction she'd captured on her camera, the unexpected moments of reconciliation and understanding. "Actually," she said, "it was pretty interesting. I have a lot to tell you about it." And as they walked together toward the baggage claim, Zoe began to share her story, not just the surface events, but the deeper currents she had observed. For the first time in years, her father seemed to be truly listening, his usual distraction replaced by genuine interest. Perhaps, Zoe thought, this was the real power of storytelling, not just to document the world as it was, but to create spaces where new understanding could take root and grow. Her documentary would capture not just a moment of conflict on an airplane, but the universal human struggle to see past our assumptions to the truth of one another. It wasn't world-changing, perhaps, but it was a beginning. James Washington emerged from the aircraft last, as was his protocol, nodding respectfully to Captain Rodriguez, who stood at the door thanking passengers as they deplaned. Their eyes met briefly in silent acknowledgement of the incident successfully navigated. In the terminal, James observed Dr. Nazari walking alongside Matthew Davidson, engaged in what appeared to be civil conversation. The teenage filmmaker, Zoe, was reuniting with a man who was presumably her father. All the players from today's drama dispersing to their separate lives, the temporary community of Flight 2387 already dissolving into memory. James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His role was prevention rather than intervention, maintaining the delicate equilibrium that allowed people to travel safely through the skies. Today, that equilibrium had been tested, but ultimately preserved. As he headed toward his connection for the return flight to Chicago, James reflected on what he had witnessed. In the confined space of an aircraft cabin, he had seen fear transform into understanding, suspicion into apology, division into tentative connection. Small transformations, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but genuine ones. There was something hopeful in that, a reminder that even in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the human capacity for growth remained. It was this possibility, as much as the physical safety of aircraft, that James had dedicated his career to protecting. Tomorrow would bring another flight, another set of passengers, another opportunity to observe humanity in transit. James Washington would be there, watchful but invisible, a guardian of the fragile peace that allowed strangers to journey together through the sky. Alina completed her post-flight checks with the same meticulous attention she had maintained for 32 years. As passengers dispersed into the terminal, their brief journey together already fading into individual memory, she found herself thinking about what would remain when she finally hung up her captain's uniform. Not the technical details of flight plans and weather patterns, perhaps. Not the maintenance schedules and safety procedures that had structured her professional life. What would remain, she suspected, were moments like today, when human complexity had been as important to navigate as the aircraft itself. "Good landing, Captain," Derek said as they gathered their belongings. "And nice work with that situation earlier." Alina nodded her acknowledgement. "Just experience. You'll handle similar scenarios yourself before long." "Maybe," Derek replied, then hesitated before adding, "but I think it was more than experience. It was, I don't know, wisdom maybe." The word caught Alina by surprise, stirring something unexpected within her. Wisdom. Not a term she associated with herself, yet perhaps it named what these decades in the air had cultivated, not just knowledge of aircraft and weather systems, but of the human heart in all its complexity. Whatever came next, retirement, a new chapter, a different kind of journey, she would carry that wisdom with her. The sky had been her classroom, teaching lessons far beyond the mechanics of flight. "See you tomorrow, Simmons," she said, shouldering her bag. 600 briefing for the return leg. "Yes, Captain," Derek replied with a grin. "Wouldn't miss it." As Alina made her way through the terminal, she found herself watching the passengers from her flight dispersing into the wider world. Matthew and Fatima still walking together toward baggage claim. Zoe animatedly talking with her father. James Washington discreetly heading toward his connection. Dozens of others whose names she would never know but whose safety she had ensured. For a few hours, they had formed a community of sorts, suspended between earth and sky. Now they carried their individual stories forward, perhaps slightly changed by their brief convergence. Alina found comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that long after her own flying days ended, these human journeys would continue, intersecting and separating, forming patterns as complex and beautiful as the weather systems she had navigated for a lifetime. Tomorrow would bring another flight, another transient community to shepherd safely through the sky. For today, that was enough. The desert sun cast long shadows across Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport as Flight 2387's passengers dispersed to their various destinations. What had begun as a routine journey had become, for some, a moment of unexpected revelation, a reminder of how quickly strangers could be transformed into adversaries through fear and misunderstanding, but also how connections could be forged across the divisions of culture, generation, and experience. For Fatima Nazari, walking alongside Matthew Davidson toward baggage claim, it was a reminder that beneath prejudice often lay fear rather than hatred, and that understanding, while not excusing harmful actions, could sometimes begin to heal their wounds. For Matthew Davidson, it was a humbling recognition of how grief and anxiety had narrowed his vision, and how acknowledging his mistakes might open a path back to the man his wife had loved, one capable of seeing beyond his own fears to the humanity of others. For Zoe Chen, it was the discovery that her camera could capture not just conflict, but redemption. The small, imperfect moments when people found their way back to better versions of themselves. For James Washington, it was confirmation of what 15 years as an air marshal had taught him, that most threats could be diffused before they escalated, and that humanity's capacity for understanding remained its greatest protection. For Alina Rodriguez, it was a reminder that the wisdom cultivated through decades of flight extended far beyond the technical aspects of aviation, embracing the complex navigation of human hearts and minds. As the Arizona sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, their separate paths diverged, yet each carried forward something from their shared journey. Not dramatic transformation, perhaps, but the quiet beginning of new understanding. In a world often defined by division, these small moments of connection across difference offered a different possibility, as fragile and precious as the delicate equilibrium of flight itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new misunderstandings, new opportunities for fear or connection. But for today, in the lingering aftermath of Flight 2387, possibility remained, suspended like an aircraft between departure and arrival, past and future, earth and sky.